In America, there are many stories that schools never teach. Stories that hide in the shadows of history. Stories that, if told, could change how people see the past. One of those stories begins not in the bright cities of today, but in a quiet corner of the South. It is the story of a town that should not exist. A town built by people who were never supposed to survive. But they did. And that is why the story matters. David Parker was not a man who chased ghosts. He was a researcher, living in New York City, with long hours buried in dusty libraries. His job was simple: collect information, write reports, and move on to the next project. He believed in facts. He believed in what could be proven. But one day, while sorting through old family letters in the city archives, David found something that made his heart stop. It was a single line written in shaky handwriting. "We built our own town. They will never erase us." No name. No location. Just a sentence, tucked inside a letter from the 1800s. David stared at it for a long time. The handwriting looked African American, written by someone who had lived through slavery. But what town? What place? Curiosity began to burn in his mind. That night, David could not sleep. He searched old newspapers, maps, and records, but found nothing. The town was not listed anywhere. It was as if it had been wiped away. The next morning, he showed the letter to his friend, James, a history teacher. James frowned. "David, if this is true, it's big. But towns like that, they don't just disappear." "Then why can't I find it?" David asked. James shook his head. "Because maybe someone wanted it hidden." Those words stuck in David's mind. Weeks passed, but the mystery grew deeper. Finally, David decided to travel south. If the letter was real, the answer would not be in a New York library, it would be in the soil where the story began. He packed his bags, took his notes, and boarded a train heading down to Alabama. The train ride was long, and David spent the hours staring out the window. The further south he went, the more the land changed. Tall trees stretched like watchmen over the tracks. Old houses, broken and forgotten, stood near the fields. It felt like stepping back in time. By the time he arrived in a small southern town, the sun was low, and the air carried the heavy smell of earth and rain. David asked locals if they had heard of a place built by freed Africans, a hidden town. Most shook their heads. Some looked away, unwilling to speak. One man laughed and said, "Son, you're chasing ghosts." But David did not give up. He knew there was something here. Something important. Late that evening, in a small diner, an old woman named Sarah Johnson overheard him asking questions. She walked up slowly, her eyes sharp but kind. "You're not from here," she said. David nodded. "No, ma'am. I'm looking for a town. A town built long ago by Africans. Do you know anything?" For a moment, Sarah was silent. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "You should not be asking about that place." David's heart quickened. So it's real. Sarah studied him, as if weighing his soul. Then she said softly, "Yes. It's real. But it was never meant to be found." Her words sent a chill down David's spine. A hidden town. A forgotten story. Sarah motioned for him to sit. She spoke slowly, with a voice heavy from years of silence. "The people who built it came here on the last slave ships. They fought for land, piece by piece. They made schools, churches, and homes when no one wanted them to survive. For years, they lived in peace. But the outside world never wanted their story told. That is why you won't find it in books." David listened carefully. Every word was like fire. He felt as if he had stumbled onto something powerful, something dangerous. Sarah looked him in the eye. "If you keep digging, you may not like what you find. David left the diner with his mind racing. The air outside was still, the streets quiet, but his heart pounded. He knew he was standing at the edge of something hidden, something America had buried long ago. The question was why? Why would a whole town, built by survivors, be erased from history? David did not have the answer yet. But he knew one thing for certain. He would not stop until he found the truth. That night, alone in his motel room, David spread out the letter, his notes, and the words Sarah had spoken. He stared at the map of Alabama, searching for a place that did not want to be seen. And then, in the silence, he whispered to himself. They built their own town. They will never erase us. The mystery was no longer just history. It was alive. And David had just taken his first step into it. The night was long for David Parker. He lay awake in his small motel room, the sound of crickets filling the silence outside. Sarah Johnson's words kept echoing in his head. It's real. But it was never meant to be found. He stared at the ceiling, restless. Why would anyone hide a town? And why would Sarah warn him to stop searching? By dawn, David knew he could not walk away. He had come too far. The next morning, he returned to the diner. Sarah was already there, sitting at her usual spot near the window. She looked at him, sighed, and shook her head. You didn't leave, she said. No, David answered. And I won't. Please, Mrs. Johnson. I need to see it. For a long time, Sarah said nothing. She stirred her coffee slowly, as if fighting an inner battle. Then finally, she stood up. Fine. Follow me. David followed Sarah through winding back roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The streets grew narrower, the houses older. The air felt heavier, as though the land itself carried secrets. At last, they stopped at a rusted gate, half buried in weeds. Beyond it stretched a dirt road, shaded by tall oak trees. This way, Sarah said. They walked in silence. As they moved deeper, David noticed old wooden houses with peeling paint. Some were abandoned, leaning with age. Others, surprisingly, were still lived in. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children played in dusty yards. David slowed his steps. His heart raced. He could not believe his eyes. A town. A living town. This is it, Sarah whispered. The place they don't want you to know about. David looked around, stunned. It was not on any map. No sign marked its name. Yet people lived here, carrying on as if time had forgotten them. He turned to Sarah. What is this place called? She hesitated. Africa Town, she said at last. The word struck David like thunder. Africa Town. Sarah led him deeper into the community. The people watched curiously as he passed. Their faces carried stories, some lined with age, others youthful but strong. They greeted Sarah with nods and soft smiles. But when they looked at David, their expressions turned guarded, cautious. They don't trust outsiders, Sarah explained. Too many times, outsiders came only to take. David understood. But he also felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Every street, every house, every step whispered survival. They reached a small church at the center of town. Its white paint was chipped, its windows cracked, but it stood tall like a proud guardian of memory. Inside, the air smelled of wood and dust. Old photographs hung on the walls, faces of men and women from another century. David's eyes lingered on one picture, a group of African men in worn clothes, standing together with unbroken spirits. Founders, Sarah said quietly. They were brought here in chains. But they built this. David's chest tightened. He realized he was standing in a place born out of defiance, out of a refusal to be erased. Sarah sat down on one of the benches, her voice heavy with memory. My grandmother told me stories about them. She said they bought land with what little they had. They built homes, schools, and this church. They spoke their language, sang their songs, and taught their children to never forget who they were. She looked at David sharply. But you won't find this in your history books. Because those in power never wanted this story told. David's hand trembled as he wrote notes. Why not? Because it proves something, Sarah said. It proves we were never broken. Outside the church, David noticed a strange silence. No road signs. No historical markers. Nothing to tell visitors this place even existed. It was as if someone had tried to erase it from the world. But here it was. Alive. As the day faded, Sarah guided him to the edge of the town. There, she stopped beside a large oak tree. The roots spread wide, gripping the soil like ancient hands. This tree has seen everything, she whispered. When the first families arrived, they met under this tree. They planned their lives here. They decided how to survive. And when outsiders came to threaten them, this tree was their witness. David placed his hand on the rough bark. He felt a strange shiver, as if the past was alive beneath his fingers. This story, he whispered, it has to be told. Sarah shook her head. Careful, Mr. Parker. Stories like this are dangerous. Once you speak them, you cannot take them back. That night, David returned to his motel with his mind on fire. He had seen the impossible, a town that wasn't supposed to exist. A community that survived against all odds. But the questions grew darker. Who tried to erase Africatown? And why was it still hidden, after so many years? David knew one thing. He could not stop now. He had stepped into a world where history breathed, and silence spoke louder than words. The town was real. But its secrets were only just beginning to surface. The night was heavy and still. David Parker sat at his desk in the motel, staring at his notes. His mind replayed everything he had seen that day: the old houses, the church, the oak tree. Africatown was not a ghost story. It was real. And yet, it felt like a ghost. Why was it missing from history books? Why did no one outside seem to know it existed? David closed his notebook. He knew he needed answers. The next morning, he returned to Africatown. The streets were quiet. Children played with sticks in the dirt, their laughter echoing against the old houses. Elders sat on porches, watching silently as David passed. Sarah was waiting for him at the church. She looked tired, as if carrying the weight of many years. "You came back," she said. "I have to," David replied. "There's more here, isn't there?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes. But it is not written in books. It is buried in the ground, in our memory, in things we keep hidden." She led him to her small home on the edge of town. Inside, the walls were lined with faded photographs and yellowed papers. The air smelled of old wood and earth. From a closet, Sarah pulled out a wooden chest. Its surface was scarred, its corners worn. She placed it gently on the table and unlocked it with a small brass key. David leaned forward, his heart racing. Inside were bundles of old letters, folded maps, rusted tools, and a set of heavy iron chains. David's breath caught. The chains were broken, but their weight told a story of suffering and survival. "These," Sarah whispered, touching them, "belonged to the first men brought here. They were chained when they stepped onto this land. But they swore those chains would never define them." She handed David a piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn map, the ink faded but still clear. On it, he saw the outline of Africatown's small houses, a church, and marked symbols in the woods. "What are these symbols?" David asked. Sarah's eyes grew dark. "Burial grounds. The first families buried their dead there. They kept the graves hidden so outsiders could not disturb them." David felt a chill. he realized that under the soil of Africatown lay not only bones but stories America had chosen to forget. Later that afternoon, Sarah guided him to one of those burial sites. The path was narrow, overgrown with vines. Birds scattered as they walked through the woods. Finally, they reached a clearing. The ground was uneven, covered with wild grass. Small, unmarked stones jutted out from the soil. "This is where they rest," Sarah whispered. "The ones who came on the last slave ship. The ones who built this town." David knelt, brushing his hand against one of the stones. It was simple, nameless. But the silence around it spoke louder than any monument. "These graves," he said quietly, "are history." "Yes," Sarah replied. "But history they never wanted remembered." As they stood there, Sarah's voice grew firm. "You must understand something, Mr. Parker. Our people built this town in secret. They worked the fields by day, but at night, they built homes, schools, and churches. They taught their children the old songs and the old words. They passed down their language from Africa. They said, 'We may be in America, but we will never forget who we are.'" David felt his chest tighten. He realized this town was not just a community. It was proof of survival. Proof that even in chains, people could rise and claim their own destiny. But just as hope filled him, Sarah's tone grew dark. "Not everyone wanted us here. Powerful men with land and money, tried to push us out. They erased our records, removed our names from books, and even tried to buy the land under us. They wanted Africatown gone." "Why?" David asked. "Because this town was a reminder," Sarah said. "A reminder that we were not broken. And some men feared that truth." As they left the burial ground, David noticed something strange. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching. When David turned to look, the figure vanished into the woods. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Sarah's face hardened. "Yes. Someone doesn't like you asking questions." David felt a chill run through him. It wasn't just history he was uncovering, it was a secret that some still wanted buried. Back in his motel that night, David spread out the letters and maps Sarah had given him. His hands trembled as he pieced together the fragments of Africatown's past. One letter caught his eye. It was written by one of the founders. "We will not be erased. If they destroy our names, we will carve them in the earth. If they silence us, our children will sing louder. And if they bury us, the soil itself will speak." David read the words again and again. He realized the soil beneath Africatown held more than bones. It held voices. Voices waiting to be heard. But outside his window, the night was not quiet. A car slowed as it passed the motel, its headlights lingering on his room. David froze, his heart pounding. He knew then his search was not just about history. It was about survival. The past was speaking, and someone wanted to silence it. The night was uneasy. David Parker sat in the dark of his motel room, the curtains pulled tight. His notebook lay open on the table, filled with maps, letters, and Sarah's words. But his eyes kept drifting to the window. That car, the one that slowed outside. Was it watching him? Or was he just imagining things? David told himself to stay calm. Yet deep down, he knew the truth. The story of Africatown was not only hidden by the past, it was being guarded in the present. The next morning, David returned to Sarah's house. She was waiting on the porch, her hands folded, her eyes sharp. "You look tired," she said. "I couldn't sleep," David admitted. "Sarah, someone was watching me last night." Her face did not change. She only nodded. "They always watch. That is why this town is silent." Inside her home, Sarah pulled out another box of papers. These were different old clippings, torn pages from books, records written in fading ink. She spread them across the table. David leaned closer, his heart racing. The first was an article from the early 1900s. The headline read, "African Settlement Refuses to Disappear." The story described how freed Africans had built their own community, but local officials refused to recognize it. Schools were denied funding. Roads were never paved. The town was left to survive on its own. Another clipping showed something darker. Landowners call for removal of Africatown. David read the words carefully. It was clear powerful men had wanted the town gone. "Do you see now?" Sarah asked. "We were never given help. They wanted us erased." David frowned. "But why erase it from history? Why not let the story live?" Sarah's eyes burned. "Because our story was proof. Proof that even in chains, we built something greater than what they gave us." That truth scared them. It meant their control was never complete. David flipped through more papers. Many had blank spaces, names scratched out, sentences missing. Entire pages of history had been silenced. "Who did this?" David asked. Sarah sighed. "The men with power. Local officials, historians, even newspapers. They told themselves they were protecting the image of America. But what they were really doing was burying our truth." Later, Sarah took David to the old schoolhouse at the edge of town. The building was small, its roof sagging, its windows broken. But inside, the chalkboard still stood, faint writing on its surface. "This was our first school," Sarah whispered. "Our people built it themselves when no one else would. Children learned here by candlelight, using scraps of paper. They were told, if no one will teach you, teach yourselves." David touched the worn wooden desks. He imagined children sitting there, repeating lessons in whispers, determined to learn even when the world wanted them silent. "This is history," David said softly. Sarah looked at him. "Yes. But tell me, how many schools teach this story? How many history books mention this place?" David could not answer. The silence in the schoolhouse spoke louder than words. That evening, David returned to his motel. But again, something felt wrong. As he unlocked his door, he noticed the handle was slightly scratched, as if someone had tried to open it. Inside, his papers were not where he left them. Someone had been there. His chest tightened. The warning Sarah had given him echoed in his mind. Stories like this are dangerous. The next day, David went back to Africatown with more questions. Sarah introduced him to another elder, Mr. Samuel Carter, a man in his 90s with a deep, weathered voice. Samuel spoke slowly, each word heavy with memory. "I was a boy when I first heard the old ones talk," he said. "They told us we were never supposed to be here. They told us powerful men tried to wipe us out. But our parents, and their parents, told us hold on to the story, even if the world never listens." He looked directly at David. "You think you discovered Africatown?" "No. Africatown discovered you. It calls who it wants." David was shaken. These people had lived their whole lives in silence, carrying a history the world refused to see. And now, somehow, he had been pulled into it. But the more he learned, the more dangerous it felt. That night, David read one of the diaries Sarah had given him. The handwriting was rough, the ink fading. But the words sent a chill through him. "We will tell our story one day. But if they try to stop us, if they try to bury us, let those who come after dig it up. We will not die in silence." David closed the diary, his hands trembling. The founders of Africatown had wanted their story told. But they had also known someone would try to stop it. And now, more than a century later, that warning was still alive. As David turned off the light and tried to rest, he couldn't escape the thought. Why had history chosen silence? And who, in the present, was still protecting that silence, The night was restless. David Parker lay awake, staring at the shadows on the motel ceiling. The diary's words echoed in his mind. We will tell our story one day. But if they try to bury us, let those who come after dig it up. He realized he was one of those people after. The story was calling him. But the weight of it pressed on his chest. Could he carry it? Would the world even listen? The next morning, David returned to Africatown. Sarah was waiting for him at the old oak tree. The morning sun cut through the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. You don't look well, she said. I didn't sleep, David admitted. Too much on my mind. Sarah studied him carefully. You've seen enough now. You know the truth. But you must decide what will you do with it. David looked at her. I have to tell it. The world needs to know. Her face grew hard. Then you must understand you will make enemies. Powerful ones. This story was hidden for a reason. Once you speak it, you cannot take it back. David followed Sarah into the small church one last time. The photographs on the wall seemed to watch him. The faces of the founders, men and women who had crossed an ocean in chains, who had refused to vanish, stared back with silent strength. They built this, Sarah said softly. With nothing but courage. They built homes when no one wanted them to. They built schools when no one would teach them. They built a future out of broken pieces. That is Africatown. David felt his throat tighten. He nodded. And I will make sure the world remembers it. That afternoon, Sarah took him to one final place, the riverbank. The air was heavy with the smell of mud and water. She pointed to the water line. Here, she whispered, the ship came. The last one. They were brought here in chains. But from this river, they walked into a new life. A hard life. A dangerous life. But a life they claimed for themselves. David stared at the river, the same water that had carried the enslaved across the ocean. He tried to imagine the fear in their hearts, and the strength it took to build a town from nothing. This river brought pain, Sarah said. But it also brought a beginning. When evening fell, David returned to his motel for the last time. He gathered his notes, his photos, the letters, the maps, the diary. He packed them carefully, as if carrying treasure. Because that's what it was. This story was treasure. Not of gold, but of truth. But as he zipped his bag, he noticed something again. The same car from before. Parked outside. Lights off. Waiting. David's chest tightened. He knew what it meant. Someone wanted to stop him. Someone still wanted Africatown's story buried. For a moment, fear washed over him. He thought about leaving everything behind, walking away, returning to New York and forgetting it all. But then he remembered the words from the diary. We will not die in silence. He straightened his back, grabbed his bag, and walked out into the night. Before he left town, David stopped once more at the oak tree. Sarah was there, as if she had been waiting. Are you ready? She asked. David nodded. Yes. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Then go. Tell it. But remember, once you do, there is no turning back. David looked up at the branches above, strong and unbroken after centuries. He felt the weight of history pressing down, but also lifting him up. I won't turn back, he said. On the train north, David stared out the window. The fields rolled past, the towns faded behind him. But Africatown stayed alive in his mind. He opened his notebook and began to write, not just for himself, but for everyone who had never been told this story. He wrote about the ship. He wrote about the chains. He wrote about the graves hidden in the soil. He wrote about the church, the school, the oak tree. He wrote about a people who refused to be erased. His hand trembled, but he kept writing. By the time the train reached New York, David had filled page after page. He knew the story would bring trouble. Some would deny it. Some would attack him. Some would try to silence him. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Silence was worse. Weeks later, David's first article was published. The headline read, "The African Town in America They Don't Teach You About." The story spread quickly. People were shocked, angry, moved. Some wanted more. Some wanted it gone. But the truth was finally out. And once truth is spoken, it cannot be buried again. Far away, under the shade of the oak tree, Sarah Johnson held the newspaper in her hands. Her old eyes filled with tears. At last, the world was listening. She whispered to the empty air, as if speaking to the ancestors. "They will never erase us." And for the first time in a long time, Africatone's silence broke into a voice that could never be silenced again.